to Arden's Neurodiversity podcast. This is Arden's third year celebrating Brain Awareness Week, which is a global campaign held every March, focused on encouraging interest and support for brain science. This year we're exploring the concept of neurodiversity and we'll be interviewing a variety of individuals to explore just how diverse our brains can be and how that impacts our experiences. Our podcast will cover a diverse range of experiences that might cover stigma, personal struggles, or potentially triggering subjects. Some of these terms that we use might be unfamiliar, so we're going to quickly go over them right now. Neurodiversity is the understanding that neurocognitive diversity is a valuable part of biodiversity. Different ways of thinking, viewing, and experiencing the world contribute to our wider society, and there is no normal or ideal way to be. Neurodivergence is a term to differentiate those who deviate from the norm in their neurocognitive type without using medicalized deficit model language. Neurotypical doesn't mean neurologically privileged, but it does mean the world is set up to cater for this neurotype by default. It's important to note that self-diagnosis is valid and many undiagnosed people will have unmet needs, so a lack of diagnosis doesn't mean that someone's neurotypical by default.
Hello, welcome to our Brain Awareness Week podcast. So just going to clarify a couple of terms that we'll be using in the aspect that we will be using them, and then we'll discuss from your point of view. So for the purpose of the interview, we will be using neurodiversity as an understanding that neurocognitive diversity is a valuable natural part of our biodiversity, and that different ways of thinking, viewing, and experiencing the world contribute to our wider society, and there's no normal or ideal way to be. Neurodivergence is a term used to differentiate those who deviate from the norm in their neurocognitive type without using medicalized deficit model language. So we focus more on the social model of neurodivergence. And just clarifying, neurotypical, when we use it, doesn't mean neurologically privileged, but it does mean the world is set up to cater for this neurotype by default. Neurotypicality should not be presumed in the lack of diagnosis. Self-diagnosis is valid, and many undiagnosed individuals may have unmet needs. So do you want to just introduce yourself for the podcast?
Yeah, perfect. So hello everybody, my name is Holly Amber Stokes and I currently work at Arden University as a senior lecturer in psychology. Alongside that, I also do a PhD in psychology part-time as well as working full-time. So that's a very broad introduction to me.
Perfect, thank you, Holly. So we've touched on the definitions that we are using during the Brain Awareness Week, but I just want to know kind of how it fits into your life. So what does neurodiversity mean to you?
Yeah, so for context then, my specific neurodivergence is that I have ADHD, specifically combined type ADHD. So for anybody who doesn't know, ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and I have all of those bits basically as combined types. So I have an attention deficit and hyperactivity. Obviously there's some debate there around it being called a deficit and those types of the words. And for me, what ADHD means or what it looks like is a difference rather than a deficit, I'd say. So what I consider it to be is that my brain is just different, it operates differently, and that means that things in the world that aren't set up for that I can find difficult, but it doesn't mean that I'm worse at things than other people might be. I just need to do them differently. So that's my specific way, I think, of thinking about my personal neurodivergence. I acknowledge that there's things that I find challenging, but that doesn't mean that I am not able to do those things. I just need to have adjustments made, perhaps, to support me in doing those.
Yeah. And with regards to your neurodivergence, how would you phrase, do you say you have ADHD, you are ADHD? How do you feel about that kind of phrasing?
I say I have ADHD, but I really don't mind either. I don't mind either way of terming it. So I think I just say that I have ADHD. Perhaps it's just a subconscious thing of I've not been diagnosed for too long. So it feels like it's something that's added on to my identity at the moment.
Yeah.
Perhaps over time, if it became more of a part of my identity that wasn't separated from what I thought I was previously, then maybe it'd be more of an intertwined thing. But at the moment, I seem to say I have ADHD, like it's a bit of an add-on, but I really don't mind either. It's not something that I worry too much over personally.
Okay, and leading on from that, how did you find out you are neurodivergent, and how did your perception of self change from being diagnosed?
Yes, so I got diagnosed just over a year ago, actually. So a little bit of context leading up to that. So I now I look back, obviously, I can see loads of signs. I'm sure that I'll get into talking about those shortly. But I was at a point in life where I had been working in the same job for a while. So I was a lecturer. I had been for a few years, and I've got my own home and I have lots of things to juggle. And I do a PhD part time, which in itself is obviously very challenging. But what I was noticing is that I was coming up against challenges which people in quote marks the normal sort of world and with a normal quote marks again brain or a neurotypical brain as we'd say here, they weren't finding as challenging. And I was starting to wonder what is it about me that is different here. So what is going on?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd previously been diagnosed with anxiety and health anxiety. And those things I'd just taken as a given. Yes, I'm anxious. That's why my brain's really busy. And that's why I can hyperfixate on certain thoughts, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So it got to a point really where I was just struggling. If we're just going to break it down, I was struggling to function. So I had my job to juggle, and within that job I was finding certain things hard from a motivation point of view. I had
Yeah.
my PhD, which yes is challenging, but I, especially compared to my peers, I found that I was just finding it way more difficult than I ever expected. When I was at school I was considered gifted and talented. I'd never had a problem from an academic point of view. It was the actual functioning within my PhD. So
Yeah.
that was going on. And then personally, trying to just manage a home was becoming really difficult. I am not a messy person, but my space was always cluttered. It just felt like I couldn't keep on top of things. And generally, what it felt like was my brain was just so busy, running at a million miles an hour. And I didn't really understand. I'd always thought, oh, you're just really anxious and you're a perfectionist, and that's why your brain is so busy.
Mm.
So actually, I laugh now, but I had an annual development review of my manager a couple of months before I got the diagnosis, where I had a bit of a breakdown and said, I can't do paperwork, which I laugh at now because it sounds like that's such a small thing. And I was really upset about it at the time. But what I actually meant was, I'm really struggling with things that should be really simple and really easy to motivate myself to do.
Yeah.
I'm missing certain deadlines or I'm missing the mark on certain things because I just don't know why, but I can't do them. Or, for example, I'd have to do something new and I just didn't understand how to do that thing if I hadn't done it before. So there were little clues like this popping up, and I started to look at some content on websites, in journals, in books around ADHD in girls. Very interesting if you are male, female, non-binary, whatever. I think that in itself is a really interesting topic to look at how we categorize certain conditions such as ADHD in a very sort of male-based perspective, rather than considering how it might present in other genders or other identities. So I started engaging in this literature around ADHD in girls, and it was a bit of a light bulb moment of that is what is going on now. And I started making a list on my phone. So of all the things I was struggling with, for example, I would interrupt people constantly. And it's not because I'm rude, it's not because I want to, or I think my thoughts are more important. It was because I needed to get my thoughts out, because otherwise I'd forget them. And I'd get so into topics and so into talking about things that I talk at a million miles an hour like I'm doing now. I should slow down. But I'd do that and I'd interrupt. I am so forgetful. That was one of the things that I've had throughout my whole life. I just lose things or wouldn't remember why I'd walked into a room. I know that's really common, but it was constant.
Yeah.
And that still is one of the most annoying parts, I think, for me, just walking into a room and standing there for 5 minutes, not being able to recall why I've gone there. But that obviously impacted my work, my studies, my personal life, having to remember lots of things, and trying multiple systems to try and organise and remember, and nothing was quite working. I didn't know why. So I had that. I also had this, like I've mentioned, this idea of my brain running at a million miles an hour. And
Yeah.
it was very interesting to me thinking back, thinking that I'd been diagnosed with anxiety, generalized anxiety. And thinking back now, they were never really anxious thoughts, except for my health anxiety, which is separate. My general thoughts weren't anxious. They were just busy. They were just loud thoughts. And that didn't quite sit right with me. It's just that I'm hyperfixating on things. It's not that that is an anxious thought I'm having. So there was a few things like that that I'd noted, alongside loads of other things around my house being a mess, and then having to do something very immediately and urgently. I had like impulsive tendencies to,
Yeah.
I need to do something, I need to do it right now. So all of those things combined, I thought, right, I will properly just have a look at this and go and get assessed. I'm privileged enough to be able to access private diagnosis, so
Mhm.
that's the route that I went. I'm sure for anyone in the UK, in England specifically, perhaps the waiting times on the NHS are long, as is for lots of neurodiverse conditions. And maybe it's the impulsiveness in me or that need for now, but I need to know. So I am privileged enough to be able to access that, luckily. So I went through a private diagnosis. The process was actually really straightforward for me. It was pretty quick from when I registered to do that through to getting the diagnosis, only a month or two.
Wow.
And after that sort of assessment, where we talked about everything from childhood up until now, that's where I got my combined ADHD diagnosis. And that was just about a year ago. Since that point, it's been a bit of a roller coaster of trying to work out, okay, so that's great, I know now. What do I need to do to adapt now to what I know, and how do I make my situation easier for myself?
Yeah.
What do I need to adjust, essentially? Um, that was a very long-winded way of saying I didn't realize for the longest time. And then when I was just noticing lots of different points of my life becoming quite chaotic and difficult to manage,
Yeah.
I needed to know why that was, and what I previously understood to be me, in terms of I had anxiety or whatever it was, that didn't seem to quite fit. It
Yeah.
was sort of like not fitting in to the difficulties I was having. So yeah, that's sort of my, in a nutshell. There's so much more I could say, but I think that's sort of the journey I had sort of just over a year ago.
Yeah. So you've spoken a little bit about how your neurodivergence impacts your sort of daily life, etc. Um, is there any kind of particular impacts it has on your life as an academic?
Yeah, definitely. So like I said, I was joking now, but at the time when I was just struggling, it was motivating myself to do things which, I say boring, they're not necessarily boring, but they are a little bit less creative or a little bit less stimulating, those are the things that I love doing, and I really get into projects. But for example, I really struggled to finish projects. That's
Yeah.
something that I'd always had, where I'd get really into it, make a start, get about 80% of the way through, and then no motivation. I'd really struggle with doing new things, like I said. So if I was tasked with something new, I've always been able to do it in the end, but I just felt like I was wandering in the dark, and I didn't really know what was expected of me. I'd need an example to work from,
Mhm.
which my colleagues didn't always seem to need. Deadlines were really difficult. So as an academic, I'm sure any academics listening would identify with marking turnarounds. So
Mhm.
specifically where I work, the marking turnaround is really short. But I was finding it really, really difficult to work towards that, because it would take me days just to motivate myself to get started. And
Mhm.
it seems like it should be easy, though. You just sit down at your laptop, right, and you just mark a piece of work. But for me, there were so many mental blocks in the way of getting to that stage and
Yeah.
getting into that act. Um, one thing about my job that works well is that specifically where I work, I do loads of different things. And for me, my neurodivergence, that works really well. I operate really well with having lots of different things going on, which is why I think when I did my undergraduate and my MSc, it didn't show as much because I had lots of modules on that I would juggle at the same time. But when I go to do my PhD, the PhD is something you self-govern, you self-direct, and it's a massive project. It's just one big massive project. You don't have the same sort of check-in points and achievements along the way, such as what you get when you do a module and you get your grade back. So I work really well with having lots of things going on at the same time where I can clearly see that I'm making an impact as well. But yeah, I was just generally struggling with motivation, doing new things. And I always thought, again, I was anxious, but I think looking back, it was just having that understanding and keeping on top of things as well. If I was motivated and interested, I was great. But if I suddenly wasn't motivated, that was really difficult. And I'd just be really forgetful. And that, as I am a perfectionist, and it's something that I do struggle with, but that combined with being forgetful and missing deadlines was really difficult to handle. So in terms of my life as an academic, that's where it was sort of showing up. And it was really basic things like admin, like I said, doing paperwork, those things where there is not that motivation, I was definitely not working well towards.
Yeah. And we often speak about how difficult it is to be neurodivergent, but what are some of the joys of having a neurodivergent mind?
Well, I think first of all, I know that a lot of people struggle with having a diagnosis like this, or a lot of people find it difficult to sort of adapt to knowing that they're neurodiverse and that they are different in some way. I have a luxury, I've not really experienced that. I perceive my ADHD to be positive. I know I'm talking about challenges, but overall it's been a positive thing for me, and the label itself has been positive. But I think that's maybe because I didn't know I had ADHD for the longest time, and I've achieved quite a lot of things that I'm really proud of despite that. So knowing that I have ADHD doesn't change that for me. I know that I can still achieve and I can still do things, but I know that I'm lucky in that way, and that's not the experience that a lot of people have. In terms of the actual strengths, and obviously these were present before I even knew I had ADHD. I am super creative. That's a really common thing that we see in people with ADHD, people with dyslexia, other types of learning differences or neurodivergence. And I absolutely love doing new things, creating new projects, and I can get really into them. And yes, I am not motivated a lot of the time, but when I am, I work so quickly and so efficiently and effectively that I can get so much done in a short space of time. So I've learned to capitalize on those times when I am creative, when I am feeling motivated, rather than trying to force it all the time. That doesn't work for me. So I think that's one of the biggest things. Another thing I think is it's really just made me an empathetic person. Even before I knew, just for some more context, my area of psychology is child development and educational psychology. So you think I'd know that I had ADHD before I knew, but apparently I didn't have that self-awareness. But it's been, I think I was always sympathetic beforehand. Actually having the diagnosis itself now and understanding what I've experienced allows me to be a little bit more empathetic. And I think that's a really nice strength to have in relating to other people, adapting to other people as well. And that's something that's really important to me generally, but in my work and in supporting, for example, students. So I think there's loads of strengths, and like I've said, I've achieved despite having ADHD, and that's really nice. I'm not trying to get away from the fact that there are challenges. That is definitely something that happens.
Yeah.
But I'm super creative and I love doing new things and I love taking on new projects. And I think it's really developed my confidence and resilience to overcome difficulties that I've had and prove to myself that even if something is difficult, I can do it. I just perhaps need to do it a slightly different way.
Yeah. So, do you think there's value to having a formal diagnosis, or is self-diagnosis equally valuable?
I think, I mean, personally, I consider self-diagnosis as valid, and I would accept that if someone has a self-diagnosis, fine, that's perfectly fine for me and considered as valid. But I think a label for me personally was useful. One thing that I did struggle with after my diagnosis was sort of ADHD imposter syndrome. Like, have I really got this, or am I like the same sort of thing? Like, am I cut out for being in this space, whatever that might be? A lot of us have it in academia, generally around academia. But I found myself having it around ADHD, and sort of convincing myself that I didn't actually have it, and I wasn't ADHD. It was a really difficult thing to get my head around. But that wasn't because of the label. I think that was just because I'd operated for so long in a model of ADHD that is, like I've mentioned, typically quite male centric. And ADHD in girls wasn't something that I was super aware of or very clued up about. So it was really interesting actually to have that diagnosis, to go through that sort of process of moving past having this ADHD imposter syndrome and validating myself. That was the only difficulty, I think, with getting the label or the diagnosis. Apart from that, it's been wholly positive for me. And like I've mentioned, I know it's not for everybody. I know some people do struggle with whatever diagnosis, whatever neurodivergence they might have. And I know that there are going to be difficult things that come with labeling. So, for example, there is a stigma attached a lot of the time. So a lot of people will look at ADHD and say, oh, you're super hyperactive, then you're jumping off the wall. Like, really, what's the word, stereotypical views that we have in society of what ADHD should look like. And that's a big part of why I felt quite impostery, I think. Because yes, I'm not jumping off the walls physically, but in my brain I am. It just looks different to me as a person with ADHD. But other than that, I think the label itself for me is good because, one, it allows me to understand what I'm experiencing and why, and to then go from there and actually look at the reading around it and the literature and understanding what I can access to help me. A big part of having a label or having a diagnosis specifically is getting adjustments. I mean, at work and in most workplaces, they don't always consider a self-diagnosis to be something that they can make adjustments based on. Hence why the formal diagnosis is useful. And in my case, the formal diagnosis was very useful. It's allowed me to get adjustments at work around having, for example, a meeting-free day where I keep a day free to just do all of my admin and my emails so I don't have to go between meetings. Or having slightly longer turnaround times, making sure that communications are clear and action points, and just advocating basically for the way that my brain works. I wouldn't say that's anything major that I've had adjusted, but those small things really do count, and that's what that diagnosis allowed me to access. And I think just overall, it's that ability to say, this is why I am the way that I am, and not in a way of like, oh, well, I've got ADHD, so I don't need to do paperwork anymore. That's not the way I'm looking at it. It's more of a, just so you know, I will sometimes go into meetings and say, if I've interrupted somebody, I will say, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I have ADHD, and that means that sometimes I jump in because I'm really excited, or I jump in because I've got a thought that I'm excited to share with you. And I think that's helped me because previously, for example, when I interrupted people, I would feel so bad about it. And it was harming sort of my self-esteem a little bit. Whereas now I understand why I do that. And being aware allows me to do it less, actually. But I also can communicate to somebody else why I perhaps work slightly differently, or I have a slightly different communication style. And then finally, I think the label has really helped. The diagnosis has helped because, and again, I know that not everybody is lucky enough to feel as comfortable in sharing that, but I'm very open generally. And it's actually helped, I think, to be sharing that and get those conversations going within our team, at work, with my PhD supervisors, with my friends. That's really been a nice thing to do, I think, and open up that space for understanding. Because I didn't know that I had ADHD, and I didn't know that people like me presenting these types of behaviours were ADHD. I didn't know that, and therefore it's likely that other people in my space don't know that either unless we talk about it. So that's been another big thing, I think, for getting the diagnosis and sharing that.
Yeah. What do you wish people knew about neurodivergent individuals like yourself. So, for example, an academic with ADHD.
It's really interesting because everybody is so different. I think at the heart of it is that neurodivergence isn't deficit. And when I teach, because I teach, for example, educational psychology, we're really keen on talking about strengths. And it's not that you have this massive collection of deficits and therefore you
Yeah.
are not as good as another person who is neurotypical, but it comes with a way of just working differently. I think on the whole, it's this communication or this trying to get across the view that neurodivergence just means different. It doesn't mean better, worse. It doesn't mean any of those things that are value judgments. It just means different to me personally.
Yeah.
I think for me personally, again, when I talk about ADHD in girls, that's been something that's really important to me, and I wish that more people knew about how it presents in girls. Obviously, we've got a long way to go on the back of a lot of girls recently being diagnosed. We
Mm-hmm.
sort of need to move backwards with the research now and look at what we need to do to account for that, because a lot of the research, a lot of the diagnostic procedures aren't geared towards girls or non-binary people. They're
Mm-hmm.
geared more towards boys and how ADHD presents in boys. Hence why a lot of girls or women are being or non-binary people are being diagnosed in later life now. So I wish that there was a better representation of what neurodivergence could look like across lots of
Yeah.
different people. It's not your typical, like I've said, ADHD, right, you're bouncing off the walls, or autism, you are really difficult to work with socially, you don't have friends, like these really stereotypical
Yeah.
views do represent some people, but definitely not the vast majority. Every neurodivergent individual is an individual and they are very different. I think we need a little bit more representation of what it looks like across the board, not just your stereotypes of what we thought those things to look like up until this point.
Yeah. What advice would you give to other people in your position? So obviously, with you being a lecturer, you're working as an academic yourself, but also supporting other
Mm-hmm.
students. So what advice would you give with regards to those things?
Um, Again, I know that not everybody is comfortable disclosing, but I find it really useful to talk quite openly with my students about what I experience, because I think it's just making it more normal, which can really
Yeah.
help. If I have a student who they might not have ADHD, but they might have other struggles, I think whether you share that you have ADHD or you share just something that's a little bit more personal, like a challenge that you experience, it can make you seem more human as a lecturer, and it
Mm-hmm.
can allow that student to see, okay, well, even my lecturers, they find things difficult from time to time. So I do find that some level, however comfortable you are, of disclosure or sharing can be really nice. And again, like I mentioned, I try and do that with my colleagues. Even if they don't want to share with me what they experience, I'm happy to share on sort of my behalf to represent that and increase awareness. I think in terms of my role in supporting students, it's very easy to slip into ways of thinking, oh, well, they have ADHD like me, so this might be useful for them because I found it useful. That's not the case.
Yeah.
Just as everybody is different in terms of how they experience their neurodivergence, everyone is different in what works for them. So when I give advice, especially if it's based on my own experience, I try and frame that very much like, this is what's worked for me. It might be useful for you, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be the be all and end all, because I don't want to instill in the students, right, well, if it doesn't work for me, I'm broken. And I
Yeah.
don't want to sort of get into that habit of resting on my laurels of what I experience must be the truth, because that's not the case. It's true to each individual.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of advice, I do think that some self-disclosure is useful if you are comfortable, but just remembering, sorry, that everybody is different and you can use your experiences. I'm a big advocate for using your experiences in providing advice and direction, but try and broaden your knowledge and your sort of resources there as well. Because that can be useful. But yeah, I don't know. It's a tricky one because I know how difficult people find it to share these things. But I've found that that's been a wholly positive experience so far. And one thing I will say is that you can still draw boundaries. You can disclose and still have a boundary of how
Mm-hmm.
much you want to talk about, how much you want to get into that, or how personal you want to get with students. And I find that students, they really respect when you set a boundary, or you're sort of saying, like, I'm happy to share this, but I don't really want to talk about these particular elements of my neurodivergence, for example. So it's a difficult balance, I guess, but I think that main thing is that being open to sharing and hearing about other people's experiences.
Yeah. And while we're on the topic of disclosing, obviously you've been quite open at work and with your students. Is that something that kind of carries on into your daily life at home? Is that something you're quite open with friends, family, general kind of basis?
Yeah, it's an interesting one again, I think. I think I'm actually more prone to sharing in the academic space because I work in psychology, and because I perhaps have an unconscious or subconscious idea that people in psychology will understand more, which I've not really thought about it too much until this point. But yeah, I guess that in the work situation, because I have the benefit of working in such an area, I assume that it will be more accepted. My family and my friends, they do know. It's not something that I talk about as much, again, perhaps because they're not in the space where that is something that's the norm to talk about.
Yeah.
But yeah, they are aware, and I am very open about sharing that. But interestingly, I think one of the things that one of my parents said when I told them was, and it was a joke, but it was this thing of like, oh, but you're not hyperactive. And it was, they were taking the mick out of this societal idea of, oh, but you need to be hyperactive, etc. But I think generally that is society's sort of view. So I'm very comfortable sharing, but I think I'd be more wary sharing more generally outside of psychology or outside of academia, perhaps, where there are more likely to be these stereotypical views compared to what I perhaps would see in my my workspace or my study space.
Awesome. So kind of last question, unless there's anything else that you wanted to add. What kind of developments would you like to see more of in neurodivergence, ADHD?
Yeah, I think, like I've mentioned quite a lot, I think we do need to continue doing research on ADHD in boys and that experience, of course, but I do think we are lacking a lot in terms of research into ADHD experiences in girls, especially in high achievers. And that's another thing that I wanted to touch on. So I think I mentioned earlier that at school, throughout primary school, secondary school, I was always considered high achieving. And that's great. I had a great experience at school. It wasn't a bad thing. But I think that might have been why a lot of my challenges were missed, because I could rest on my laurels essentially and still do well, and therefore I'm not being paid attention to as somebody who might need a bit of support in certain areas. I look back at my childhood now and see a lot of experiences of being quite emotionally overwhelmed, which is another thing that you might see in non-stereotypical ADHD sort of presentation, being quite overwhelmed, struggling to keep friendship groups or maintain friendships, those sorts of things as well. So I wasn't struggling so much with the academic side, but perhaps the other things that go on around school. So I think it'd be really good to see a little bit more research around non sort of research that's not based just on boys, research that isn't just based on the people who are presenting as having an educational difficulty, perhaps, but looking at those who are also high achieving. And it'd be really nice to see some research, I think, around how people getting diagnosed later in life are handling that, or what they're doing after that point to sort of backtrack and figure out, okay, well, what do I need to do to help myself, or what can my workplace do? So in terms of research, that's what I'd really like to see. Another thing that I've not mentioned, which is a whole other topic in itself, is something that people with ADHD can experience, is rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which is a really interesting topic. If you've got time, please do go and read about it. It's definitely something that I experience, and I believe, don't quote me on this, but I do believe it's something that we see less in boys and more in other genders. And I think we've got a nice space there to do more research around that in particular. And I think that explains a lot of the emotional aspects of ADHD. And that in itself can be really difficult to handle throughout studying, throughout working. with friends and family and relationships, all of those things, that is something that can impact all of those areas. So it'd be really nice to see some of that. Obviously, like I've mentioned, I went private for my diagnosis. Unfortunately, there is a long wait and it is difficult, and I understand, especially as someone with health anxiety, the difficulties of going into a healthcare space to even approach. I think that's why I went private. Part of it was I don't have to go to my GP surgery where I have a lot of anxiety. I can go and do this all online, more or less, around getting a private diagnosis. So I think the accessibility of doing that and also being validated. I mean, my process was really positive, but I know from other people going to their GP or wherever and not being validated, or their concerns not being taken seriously. When I had my diagnosis, something that was really interesting that the assessor, the doctor, said to me was that, and again, don't quote me on the stats, but I think she said something around 70% of individuals who previously were diagnosed with anxiety and had anti-anxiety medication, after they got an ADHD diagnosis and therefore accessed ADHD medication, 70% of those people were off of their anti-anxiety med. And it seems that there is quite a big group of people who are perhaps being misdiagnosed with other mental health conditions, where the crux of the issue is their neurodivergent. That's the thing that is causing those difficulties. So again, perhaps just a little bit more understanding around that, and not being so quick to diagnose things such as anxiety, where there might actually be an underlying cause for those things. But generally, like I said, my experience has been quite positive. My workplace have been great in making adjustments. Again, not everybody is as lucky, so it'd be really nice to see a little bit more guidance and research around adjustments that can be made. Specifically in academia, it's a very fast-paced place to work, and there's a lot of pressures on you as a lecturer, as an academic. So any research around those things would be great to see as well.
Great. Was there anything else that you wanted to share before we finish?
I don't think so. I think I've addressed most of it without taking up like 5 hours of everybody's time. But I think I just wanted to get across this idea that I actually had no idea. And if anybody in our team specifically, for example, I'm one of the very few people who teach educational psychology and developmental psychology, and I didn't even know. So it's okay to realize this a bit later down the line, and even if you are 50, 60, 70 years old, whatever it might be, it's never too late to pursue understanding yourself and understanding the way that your brain works. But yeah, I think just reaching out, and whether that be reaching out to resources or reaching out to other people, and just exploring different elements of neurodiversity can be useful if you are finding that your brain isn't perhaps working the same way as somebody else's, or the norm. Again, norm in quotation marks there. But yeah, I had no idea, and that's okay. It's fine to not know. And I did feel a bit silly afterwards, thinking, how on earth did I not realise this? And it's definitely a process. I mean, especially if it's something quite closely linked to your identity, which is for a lot of people their neurodivergence. Having that as quite it is quite a process of acknowledging that something might be going on. Okay, I'll go and explore this, and then maybe you get a diagnosis. Okay, what do I do with that? I've been in a bit of a black hole, I felt, for a while in this year, of being like, I know what's going on, but what do I do? And that was a difficult part. So it's definitely a process to work through. But it's okay to not know, and then to know really late down the line, and have to go back and sort of explore things in retrospect as well. But yeah, I think I'm really happy. I'm happy to have ADHD. I guess that's a fair comment to make. Or I regard it really positively, and there's a lot of positives that come with that. It's not all just challenges. And if you feel like maybe you have ADHD or neurodivergence, a different type of neurodivergence, and you do feel that there's not a lot of positives there, you might want to do some exploring around the things that you are really good at, because I'm sure there are some. It might just be that the current job you're in, or the current path that you're going down, isn't tapping into those positives. I'm lucky that I have a job where I can tap into them, but there's certain careers that might not be as suited there. I'm going off on a tangent, typical ADHD brain, but I will stop there. But thank you so much for letting me come on and talk about this.
Awesome. And thank you so much for, sharing your experiences and letting us into your brain for a little bit.
Oh, you're very welcome anytime, but I would talk for hours and hours, so we'll bring it to a close.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Holly.
To our listeners, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening to our podcast and being part of Arden's third Brain Awareness Week celebration. Through these interviews, we explore neurodivergent identity, key ways to mitigate and celebrate neurodivergent needs and skills, and interesting ideas for future brain-related research that some of you listeners might end up being a part of. This year we have a selection of podcast episodes along with an art competition. If you'd like some more information or a chance to be involved in next year's events, email baw@arden.ac.uk. Once again, a big thank you to all our guests and to the Brain Awareness team who made this podcast possible. And with that being said, take care and hydrate your brains.